Good afternoon, everyone, excuse me, good evening, everyone. My name is Jean-Pierre Brutus. I am a senior counsel at the Economic Justice Institute at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and I'm also the convener of the New Jersey Reparations Council. Welcome all of you to the 8th public session of the New Jersey Reparations Council, hosted by the Economic Justice Committee. Thank you so much for joining us. I would just like to let you know that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. Press is in attendance to listen only. Closed captioning is available for anyone who needs it. Just hit the appropriate button. In the first part of this session, the committee will discuss their work on economic justice in New Jersey in regards to reparations. And in the second half of this session, we will provide for public comment. This is the 8th of the 9 public sessions of the council, as I said earlier. Our next public session will be hosted in February by the Public Education and Narrative Committee, and that will be the last of our public sessions. Please be on the lookout for publicity for this session in the next few weeks. Please go to www.njreparationscouncil.org to find out more. Once again, that is www.njreparationscouncil.org. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to our partners at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for making the NJ Reparations Council possible. You will hear shortly from Amber Randolph, the first Associate Vice President of New Jersey at RWJF. Tonight, you will also hear from the members of the Economic Justice Committee, co-directors Henry Coleman and Walter Grayson, members Nicole Rodriguez, Jermaine Toney, Beverly Brown-Ruggia, and Derek Hamilton. The discussion will be moderated by Council Co-Chair Dean Tajania Henderson. We'll then open up to the public comment portion after that. The question we often confront doing this work here is, why convene the New Jersey Reparations Council? And to the answer that is that slavery shaped every aspect of New Jersey. And too many people in our state believe that it never happened here and that racial inequality is not an issue in New Jersey. As you will hear tonight, New Jersey's original sin of slavery and its lasting stain tell a very different story. Co-chaired by Khalil Gibran Muhammad and Tajina Henderson, and comprised of local, state, and national experts, the New Jersey Reparations Council is finally confronting and working to repair the enduring harm from New Jersey's deep and often overlooked institution of slavery, and enduring impact on the contemporary life of Black people in our state. Because these inequalities have been reinforced not by individual behaviors, but by generations of policy design rooted in slavery, they must be repaired by policy design. The council will not only propose bold strategic policies to repair the enduring harm to Black people from slavery, but it will also answer this foundational question. What kinds of reparative systems does New Jersey need to build for Black people to finally be free, to thrive, free to win, free to be whole, free to encounter justice? Our affirmative vision is for the council to think boldly and imaginatively to propose solutions that address the varied and manifold harms of slavery and address the structural racism at the core of these harms through reparative policies and investments that are commensurate and proportional to the enduring harms from slavery. This Juneteenth 2025, the council will produce a report drawing direct connections between New Jersey's history and its present and propose comprehensive policy recommendations that will all on their own serve as a blueprint for how New Jersey can repair these enduring harms of slavery and also act as a vast resource to the Jersey Reparations Task Force that New Jersey will ultimately create through law, thanks to the ongoing advocacy of our faith allies for reparations partners. As we look ahead to the council's work, it is both thrilling and, to be sure, daunting. But we know the only way forward to building a New Jersey is through. We are convinced that every movement for racial justice requires fierce and independent advances to lift the voices when others won't. We are also convinced that the New Jersey Reparations Council, building on decades-long fighting in the state, will help to move the issue of reparations from unsafe and unpalatable and impossible to inevitable and conventional wisdom, to common sense, good sense. Reparations as good sense that will serve as a basis for racial justice in New Jersey. and we thank you for standing with us in this journey. I am now pleased to pass the mic to Amber Randolph, First Associate Vice President, New Jersey at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. As Jean-Pierre said, I'm Amber Randolph. I am the AVP for New Jersey at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I am honored to speak with you briefly today. My colleagues and I at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation are steadfastly committed to achieving health equity in New Jersey, which means that everyone who calls our state home has a fair and just opportunity to live their healthiest life possible. And yet the current reality is that there are large, persistent, and increasing gaps in opportunities for health and well-being across neighborhoods and communities, depending on who you are and where you live. In 2021, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention declared racism a public health issue, affecting the health and well-being of millions of people directly. As the nation's largest philanthropy dedicated to health, we deeply believe in dismantling structural racism and the barriers that millions face every day simply because of their race or their intersectionality with other groups that experience oppression. We all have a responsibility and the ability to achieve health equity by striving for racial equity and treating the root cause of disparities. To do this right requires a great deal of research, planning, and public dialogue, which is why we're here today. Since 2021, RWJF has funded efforts to learn from the global experiences and impact of reparations, to learn how reparations could close the racial health and wealth gaps that persistently impact Black Americans and Indigenous people, and strengthen the reparations field directly by supporting organizing efforts, capacity building, and technical assistance, and building towards federal, state, and/or local policy action. And now the foundation is funding the Reparations Council to serve as the leading edge of efforts to convene a non-governmental process to initiate this necessary work. As a funder of the council, the foundation is clear in our stance that the time has come for New Jersey to create a shared understanding of the harms caused to Black New Jerseyans over the past 4 centuries and embark on a process to remedy these injustices. We see the council's work as a critical precursor to realizing the justice that our governments owe to Black New Jerseyans. To achieve this, we need federal, state, and local governments to take up the mantle of this work. In 2008, we saw an important acknowledgement of structural racism and its resulting harm when the New Jersey State Legislature passed a resolution apologizing for past leaders perpetuating the institution of slavery. But our home state needs much more than more intentional action to repair generations of harm. And it needs it now, perhaps more than ever. That is why the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, as part of our policy agenda for a healthier, more equitable New Jersey report, is calling on the state of New Jersey to impanel an official task force to begin a process to address historic and present harms. The task force would ideally include a diverse group of people, including community members and affected residents, who have the authority to make recommendations to the legislature, governor, and agencies, such as how to reinvest funds in infected communities. Together, we have an opportunity to set a national example by addressing structural racism in a thoughtful and comprehensive manner. Our commitment to do so is rooted in our dedication to health, equity, and justice. Bringing history to light can help shape a more accurate narrative of the impact that structural racism has played and continues to play in New Jersey residents' health and well-being, particularly in communities of color. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. My colleagues are beyond proud to be on this journey and eager to engage in the hard work it will require. I'm excited about the critical discussion we will have today with the Economic Justice Committee. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jean-Pierre.
Thank you so much, Amber, and thank you to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce one of our 2 co-chairs of the council, Dean Tajania Henderson. Dean Tajania Henderson serves as the Dean of the Graduate School at Rutgers University Newark, where she's also a professor at Rutgers Law School. Her scholarship focuses on historical impact of punishment regimes on property systems in the US, and she is particularly interested in the legal histories of incarceration and chattel slavery. Please welcome Dean Tajani Henderson.
Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre. As always, it is an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you and all of our stakeholders across the state. As you've heard this evening, the work of the New Jersey Reparations Council is being headed up by 9 committees, each of which is tasked with bringing to the fore the most impactful data and research available on the legacy of racial slavery and Jim Crow right here in the state. This Economic Justice Committee is specifically examining New Jersey's historical and current structural racism within the economy and how this drives the state's staggering wealth gap and other economic inequities. The committee's work spans from the era of slavery through redlining, the GI Bill, to current policies in the 21st century. It examines the job market, wages and benefits, worker protections, banking, loans, lending practices, credit, the tax system, and other elements of the economy. It also examines the critical relationship between homeownership and racial inequities in wealth. It's my pleasure to introduce, as a general matter, the members of this committee before I turn it over to our co-chairs. Walter Greason is the DeWitt Wallace Professor of History at Macalester College. Dr. Henry Coleman is the Senior Policy Fellow and Professor Emeritus in the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. Joining them are Beverly Brown-Ruggia, the Financial Justice Program Director for the New Jersey Citizen Action, a statewide grassroots nonprofit dedicated to economic, social, and racial justice. Nicole Rodriguez, who's President and Research Director of New Jersey Policy Perspective. Professor Jermaine Toney, who's a Professor of Economics in the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. And Professor Derek Hamilton, the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our committee co-chairs, Dr. Greason and Dr. Coleman.
Thank you, Dean Henderson. I'm going to kick things off first by just saying good evening and welcome to all of the individuals who are joining us for this public session. We are grateful to you all, and we're looking forward to your comments, questions, and other input. Tonight, we're going to explore several aspects of economic justice for Blacks in New Jersey, including the history of slavery, segregation, and discrimination in New Jersey. We're going to review some of the wage, income, and wealth evidence with respect to economic injustice. Many people feel that those are the indicators of the extent to which economic injustice exists here in the state of New Jersey. We'll review some of the reparations information available about reparations paid to other entities, other groups by different units of government. We're going to talk a bit about the importance of the transfer of wealth across generations. We'll talk about sustainability of the reparations that should be provided and the need to protect wealth and build institutions in the Black community. And then we'll move on to look at some of the major recommendations that are being considered by the Economic Justice Committee. We'll probably conclude with some overview of the next steps in this whole process by the Institute. So with that, Dean Henderson, I'll turn back to you for the first question to the first committee member, who will be our co-chair, Walter Greason.
Good evening. Thank you again, and thank you so much. Dr. Greason, our question is a simple one, and it helps to begin at the beginning. Why are reparations for Black Americans needed in New Jersey?
Thank you so much. The work of the council and your leadership has been so inspirational. It's an honor to be here with my co-chair, Dean Professor Emeritus Coleman, as well as all of the extraordinary people who have served in this discussion over the last year and a half. To answer the question, I begin with a question. When we say the words economic justice, what do we mean? In the context of the transnational struggles for Black reparations, the idea of economic justice holds central importance and I am here to open the public hearing on Black reparations in New Jersey with a brief history of racial injustice in terms of commerce, trade, and economics in the Garden State. Why are reparations for Black Americans needed in New Jersey? This answer begins at the Tinton Iron Works, site of more than 60 enslaved Africans laboring in the creation of New Jersey's colonial economy between 1670 and 1770. From the first moments of European settlement in this region, a debt to enslaved Africans grew in response to the imperial extraction of their labor. Much more importantly, however, was the expansion of racial enslavement in this economy between 1720 and 1810, when enslaved Africans were the single most valuable commodity in the region. That is to say, when we start to look in the century that follows, the value of enslaved Africans exceeded the value of the railroads, the banks, and every staple cash crop that we have ever studied in a social studies class. Africans were the money that stimulated the way that this state was created. The creation of discriminatory and segregated markets between 1777 and 1881 created a framework for unending impoverishment across generations. In order to explain this, everyone should learn the story of Colonel Ty, enslaved near the area on the northern beaches of New Jersey, Sandy Hook. He stimulated and organized a rebellion for 2 years, from 1776 to 1778, during the American Revolution, that exposed the hypocrisy of independence from Great Britain. Joining with the British and then wounded in action that ultimately led to his death, he inspired thousands of African Americans to flee from the United States at its founding, to find freedom in Canada, in the United Kingdom, and also on the African continent, in the state that would become Liberia. In addition, New Jersey and its municipalities often enforce codes against Black residency and mobility, in conjunction with, and I emphasize, the extended enslavement of gradual emancipation. The laws that were passed did not lead to immediate freedom for Black people in this state. These practices foreshadowed the systems of Jim Crow segregation that emerged after 1877 across the country. These formal and informal systems of oppression denied Black Americans in New Jersey the full protection of both the state constitution and the federal constitution for 157 years, from 1791 to 1948. Racial discrimination in all aspects of New Jersey society was virulent until 1947. We were the second largest state in the country to host the Ku Klux Klan. The anti-immigrant and anti-Black sentiment shaped every aspect of life in the early 20th century. It carried Woodrow Wilson to the presidency. And this anti-Black racism continued to evolve aggressively after the state constitution was changed to favor anti-discrimination as a core principle of our society. From that basis, the state passed a series of laws and judicial rulings between 1948 and 2020, but the racism continued to adapt and persisted in keeping an unequal status for Black Americans. As a result, Black Americans in New Jersey suffered racial disparities in wealth, income, employment, education, healthcare, and nearly every measurable statistic of demographic and economic progress. The history of Timothy Thomas Fortune, Florence Spearing Randolph, Marion Thompson Wright, Lenora Walker McKay, Walter McAfee, Nicey Marion Ham Russell, and Clement Price shows the power of the Black freedom struggle across the long 20th century. Yet at each and every turn, these leaders were frustrated, stymied, and limited in the ways that they could bring economic justice to Black people in New Jersey. Reparations for Black Americans in this state are essential to achieve the promises of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the New Jersey State Constitution. The inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property have never provided equal protection to Black Americans in this state. For us, the pursuit of happiness has been perpetually denied. The hidden cost of this exploitation has been the unjust crippling of the entire state's economy. Reparations for Black Americans in New Jersey will dramatically strengthen all sectors of investment and employment for all people in the state and the larger megapolitan region. In a global competition for sustainable development, it is past time that the state stopped crippling itself with these systems of racial injustice. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tajania. Dean, thank you for the opportunity to share this foundation for our work.
I appreciate the foundation, and I especially appreciate your grounding in the 17th century in the Tinton Iron Works. I always learn so much whenever I am here in our public sessions. When you say Africans were the money that stimulated the economy built in this state, I think it's important for people to understand what that means. The value of enslaved Africans being higher than the value of anything else happening here in what was a colony and then what would become the state. And that's actually borne out throughout the US South. So throughout the slaveholding South, it was initially enslaved Africans and later, generations later, enslaved African Americans, the value of which exceeded the value of any other good in the region. And so when we talk about slavery and we talk about its impact on an economy, we have to place the value of humans at the center. And that's ghastly work, Dr. Greason, but it is critically important, not only that we remember the bodies at the center of this economic model, but also remember the value that was stripped from them, the extraction that something like slavery and forced labor requires. So thank you so much for helping us level set first thing this evening.
Amen. Thank you.
I would love to introduce Nicole Rodriguez, who is President and Research Director of New Jersey Policy Perspective. I think, Nicole, it's really, I think, a good thing to remind people that New Jersey is a wealthy state. Of the 15 richest counties in America, 2 of them are in New Jersey. New Jersey has an outsized wealth compared to other states in the US. And so given this, we're still facing the reality that Black residents in the state face significant economic challenges. And I'm wondering if you can walk us a bit through the data on this, the data on wealth disparities, the data on income disparities, the data on wage disparities, and to help us try to understand better the scope of these inequities and what it means for Black New Jerseyans that, 2 of the richest counties in the nation are here, and yet Black people here are still experiencing such low wealth and such few opportunities for wealth accumulation.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Tajania, and thank you so much to the Institute for Social Justice and the Reparations Council for this opportunity to speak today. And I'm really happy that Walter came before me because history really is a roadmap for the future. And the legacy of slavery is why we're seeing a lot of the indicators that I'm going to be talking about and why we see such drastic gaps between Black New Jerseyans and white New Jerseyans. And part of the discussion, and that I hope we are, we're all going to be emphasizing is why reparations is necessary, but also urgent, particularly for Black New Jerseyans. And as we, Tajania just said, New Jersey is one of the wealthiest states in the country. And while many others are focusing and have been able to focus on building wealth, securing homes, preparing for retirement, many Black New Jerseyans are still struggling to make ends meet. And these economic inequities are not accidental. They are a result of structural racism embedded in politics, policies, and practices that have persisted for centuries. And today, I'll focus on 3 critical areas: wages, income, and wealth, to illustrate the depth of these disparities and highlight why reparations are essential for achieving economic justice. And we'll start with wages. So if we could go to the first slide. Thank you so much. Wages is really the foundation for economic mobility. And just to be clear, when I say wages, I mean money simply exchanged for work from an employer. And the wage gap between Black and white workers in New Jersey has significantly widened over the last 5 decades. From 1979 to 2023, where we have the most recent data, Black workers experienced only a 13% increase in wages, while white workers saw their wages increase by 44%. That's a major gap. And why is this happening? There are many, many reasons for why this is happening. There is persistent discrimination in hiring and pay, which means Black workers are often paid and earn less than their white counterparts for the exact same work. Black workers are disproportionately represented in low-wage industries where opportunities for advancements are scarce and wage enforcement is weak. And at the same time, most of the wage growth that we have seen since the 1970s has gone primarily to the top 1% of people. So the impact is clear. Lower wages limit Black workers' ability to save, to invest, and to build economic stability. And this is not an individual issue. It's a systemic problem that holds entire communities back. So we'll look at income next. If you could go to the next slide, thank you. We're going to look at household income. And to define income, it's essentially a wider term than wages. It includes money that one receives in the form of, for example, for dividends, profits, even interest in your savings account, that is considered income. So if you look on the left, at least it's my left, in 2010, Black New Jerseyans are in the dark blue bar there, and white New Jerseyans are in the orange bar. So if you look on the left in 2010, 24 years ago, the median household income for Black workers, Black families in New Jersey was about $46,000, while for white families was about $73,000. So that was about a gap between them is 37, there's a 30%, a 37% gap. So now we fast forward to today. The good thing is that incomes have risen overall. But the devastating thing is the gap has nearly doubled. Double to 60%. Black households earn a median of about $66,000 compared to about $105,000 for white households. So what's driving this? Many of the same things that drive wage inequality is also driving income inequality. But we can also add to the list is discrimination in promotions and access to higher paying jobs, which continue to limit upward mobility for Black workers, and the many policies that fail to enforce fair wages and protect workers. And the failure of those policies disproportionately harm Black families. And this growing gap really reinforces economic inequities that make it harder for Black families to access opportunities like home ownership, higher education, and financial stability. Which leads me to my last indicator, which is wealth. Wealth is what many consider the alternate measure of economic security. And wealth provides opportunity. It enables families to weather financial shocks, like many of us have felt during the pandemic. It allows for families to make long-term investments in their future, like paying for college or making a down payment on a house. It also allows for opportunity to pass your wealth to future generations so that it can build and last. But That's not always the case for everybody in the state or in this country. Overall, the average white family holds, and this is nationwide, the average white family holds about 6 times as much wealth as the average Black family. And wealth disparities for young people are even more stark, with young white Americans holding 16 times the wealth of young Black Americans before they turn 25. So it starts really young, and education is not an equity indicator. There are many other systemic and racist issues that our country needs to deal with, but a lot of this is driven by public policy. Housing policies in particular, from redlining to exclusionary zoning, have played a major role in maintaining systemic racism, worsening the damaging cycle of wealth inequality. So if we look at the next slide, oh, excuse me, this is the next slide. So if we look at this slide, we look at 2010. The median value of homes owned by Black New Jerseyans was about $255,000 compared to $344,000 for white homeowners. So that's about a 25% gap. 24 years later, home values have risen for both groups, but the gap, like we've seen in previous trends, have widened. And it's widened to now 35%. So Black-owned homes are now valued at $370,000, while white-owned homes are worth about $433,000. And this is the median value for homeowner-occupied units. So today, many New Jerseyans pay more than what they can afford in housing costs, making it difficult to make ends meet and provide for families. And kind of looking at this in a different way, we talked about what this means for the value of a home, but what does it mean for affordability? And for affordability, in New Jersey, 41% of Black homeowners pay more than 30% of their total income to housing, which by definition, by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, is considered a housing burden. And for white New Jersey, it's still high, to be fair, but it's significantly lower. 30% of white homeowners in New Jersey pay more than 30% of their total income to housing costs. And these disparities are very much documented and rooted in systemic racism, from redlining to housing discrimination. And for decades, Black families were denied access to mortgages, pushed into neighborhoods with lower property values. And even when they managed to buy homes, their properties have appreciated at slower rates than those in predominantly white areas. And this wealth gap has ripple effects. It limits Black families' ability to save for retirement, start businesses, or even investing in their kids' education. And it also perpetuates the cycle of inequity, making it really hard for future generations to achieve economic security. So I will end with this. These disparities in wages, income, and wealth are not just statistics. They are a legacy of systemic racism that continue to impact Black New Jerseyans today. And reparations are a necessary tool to address this legacy, because they can close wage and income gaps by investing in job training, education, enforcement of fair labor practices, investing in more robust tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit or the Child Tax Credit, baby bonds, guaranteed income programs, and so much more. And reparations can reduce the wealth gap by expanding access to home ownership, providing grants for Black-owned businesses, addressing the long-term effects of redlining and housing discrimination. And reparations is not just about addressing the injustices of the past. It's about creating a future where every New Jersey resident has the opportunity to thrive. So reparations, for me, and I think you'll see this as a theme, paired with bold, intentional public policy, are not only a moral imperative, but also economic necessity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I think, in case folks missed what you were describing here, it's important to understand that white Americans nationwide and in New Jersey have far more wealth than Black Americans. So if we're talking about just nationwide, the median net worth of white families is more than 40 times the net worth of Black families.
Mhm.
In New Jersey, the median net worth of white families is more than 55 times the median net worth of Black families. And so what we're really talking about here is it's a sort of a near exponential, right? Near exponential disparity
Mhm.
that higher wages for a few people will not correct. This cannot be solved by some sort of piecemeal types of solutions. And if we aren't talking about generational wealth transfers and how generational wealth transfers in some cases originating from those houses that were purchased by GI Bills,
Yeah,
GI Bill benefits that Black families did not have access to. Those homes then increased in value, and that value has been passed down to new generations and has been able to be leveraged to get people access to other homes and to move up in neighborhoods. And understanding that pathway to the wealth that would have originated out of the 1940s and 1950s has simply not been available to Black Americans and not to Black New Jerseyans for no other reason than color. I
absolutely.
think helps to drive home your point that reparations is necessary. This isn't just about what we think feels good, but rather about a necessity. And I really appreciate you putting that in those terms for all of us. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Next up, we are hearing from Dr. Henry Coleman, who is a professor emeritus at the Blaustein School at Rutgers University. Dr. Coleman, would New Jersey even be an outlier if it were to implement a program of reparations for racial slavery and Jim Crow? Where would New Jersey sort of land among the states who are doing this work or not doing this work?
Well, in order to respond to your question, Dean, I'm also going to rely on a few slides. So if you would cue those up for me, these will help me to make my points and hopefully keep me on time as well. So. Okay, so I'll start my comments by saying that reparations to address various economic, social, political, and other injustices have been provided by various governmental entities, and by that I mean other nations, I mean the U.S. federal government, and I mean a variety of states and localities here in the United States. These reparations have been provided over an extended period of time. I will provide some evidence to show that we can date it back at least to the 1940s up through the current period. These reparations have been provided in varying amounts and using various financing techniques. And finally, I'll argue that reparations have been used for a variety of different reasons, ranging from attempting to atone for human rights abuses, political disenfranchisement, medical malfeasance, and even for injustices perpetrated by third parties. So please, to the next slide. Now, I'm going to share some examples of reparations provided by other countries. And for those of you that are experts in this area, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but I think an illustrative one. So for example, we can talk about the reparations provided by Germany to Israel, some of the Holocaust survivors and their heirs for the genocide perpetrated against Jews during the Holocaust. We can talk about reparations provided by the country of South Africa. Many of us are familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that was established in that country, but victims were paid victims of apartheid received compensation. I'm not going to argue to you that the amount of the accommodations were what they should have been, but nevertheless, there was that effort. In the country of Chile, payments were made to the victims of human rights abuse and or other kind of political violence, particularly during the Pinochet regime. And most recently, I would argue, in Canada, payments have been made to Indigenous people for crimes, especially physical and sexual abuse, committed against Indigenous children at residential schools. So all of these are examples of other countries making use of reparations as a means for trying to make amends for injustices. Let's go to the next slide, please. It's hard to understand some of the reluctance on the part of the national government, our federal government, because indeed reparations have been used by the federal government as an instrument for trying to correct or make amends for various injustices. So we could look at things such as the U.S. Indian Claims Commission as far back as 1946, where approximately $3.4 billion were provided to Native Americans to make amends for colonization and forced relocation, stolen lands, particularly since 1776. Many of the people on the call may be familiar with the Tuskegee study, where Blacks were untreated for syphilis over a period extending from at least 1932 up until 1972. So about $10 million. Again, not necessarily an adequate amount, but an attempt was made by the national government to atone for those atrocities. The individuals who were interred forcefully, the Japanese and Aleutian Island victims, they were compensated for their loss of liberty and property during the internment period around the Second World War. You could also look at other instances, such as the September 11th tragedy. This was in response to the 9/11 attacks, where a victims' compensation fund was established by the federal government. We had a similar effort on the part of the national government in response to the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2023. I'm not sure, that's when the fund was set up. We can talk about compensation paid by the national government to the Iranian hostages, those individuals that were held by in the country of Iran, I think for a period of 444 days, were compensated by our national government. We can also talk about Black farmers pretty recently, where they received about $2.2 billion. These were funds paid to Black farmers who were denied loans and other kind of financial assistance over a period of at least from 1981 to 1996. Now, there are a couple of interesting things that I think jump out from this table, at least to me. One of which is that the federal government will often provide or has often provided reparations even when it was not the source of the transgression. So if we look again at this September 11th reparations, if we look at the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting reparations, if we look at the Iranian hostages, those were not crimes committed or injustices committed directly by the federal government, but the U.S. government indeed did step up and provide reparations. Note also missing from this list is the 1965 Special Field Order number 15. That's the proposed 40 acres and a mule. While that was proposed, it was subsequently rescinded in the aftermath of the death of Abraham Lincoln. Let's go to the next slide, please. We could also look at subnational jurisdictions. These are state and local governments here in the U.S. that have paid reparations for specific transgressions against Black and other indigenous people of color. So we have 3 sterilization situations where reparations were paid. This is when forced sterilization was imposed upon individuals who were residents at state institutions, whether they be mental facilities or in a couple of cases, I think that also included prisons. But that was the case in terms of California, In 1909, legislation was passed to involuntarily sterilize individuals. That was the case in North Carolina in 1919, and that was the case in Virginia in 1924. We also have a couple of more recent cases of states or sub-state jurisdictions providing reparations. So the Chicago Police Department paid reparations to victims of torture and abuse by the Chicago Police Department, where that abuse took place between 1970 and 1990. We also have reparations that were provided in 1994 by the state of Florida. This is compensation for the victims of the massacre in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. Again, this list probably should be a lot longer. We know, for example, that there was a similar massacre of individuals in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I think the courts have recently ruled against the proposed reparations that were being considered in that state, but that should another situation. If we go to the next slide, please. This slide indicates recent actions, and you can look at the dates there to get an indication of what I mean by recent actions. It looks as if all of these activities have taken place between 2021 and 2024. But these are all instances of reparations being provided in some form or another by local jurisdictions. Now, I won't try to go through all of this, but a couple have been pretty high profile. So most people are familiar with the reparations program in Evanston, Illinois. Many people consider that to be the first one, where about $10 million was provided for individuals who had been denied certain housing opportunities, and most of those monies were directed at improving the housing opportunities for residents of Evanston, Illinois, through things like subsidized down payments and the like. The most recent, as far as I can tell, is something that happened just several weeks ago. This was in Palm Springs, California, where victims were compensated to the tune of about $6 million for land takings during the development in the Palm Springs area. But in each one of these instances listed here, there has been either actual reparations, some type of report that's been commissioned, or at least legislation that has been introduced to proposing to set up a panel to study the possibility of making reparations to atone for various kind of transgressions, ranging all the way from slavery up through current period discrimination. Let's turn to the next slide, please. Well, I take several conclusions from all of this data, and I understand I've gone through it pretty thoroughly, but I think the picture is pretty clear just from the scant evidence provided. One conclusion that stands out to me is that the notion of providing reparations is neither new nor novel. So New Jersey is certainly not going to be out front, and in no way would it be considered an outlier if in fact it got on board and attempted to atone for some of its transgressions during the period of slavery or subsequent Jim Crow. Many other countries, as well as numerous governmental entities in the US, have resorted to reparations as a means of atoning for various injustices perpetrated against select group of individuals. Oh, by the way, I've only spoken to those reparations made available by governmental entities. We also know that there have been some private efforts. Many people are familiar with the efforts by Georgetown University, but there are other efforts by other universities, such as the Princeton Theological Seminary, the Virginia Theological Seminary. There have been some efforts by some private entities. I can think in particular about Aetna Insurance, Wachovia Financial Institutions, and JP Morgan Bank, where at least an apology, where many people feel that that is a component of providing reparations, but at least an apology has been forthcoming in recognition of their roles during enslavement. I think it's fair to conclude that more and more state and localities are studying their roles during the period of enslavement and more recent transgressions against Black, and are implementing policies and programs to make amends. So it's not as if other states are just standing still, but they are in fact trying to make atonement for their actions. So such actions by these other jurisdictions, in my view, beg the question of why the federal government and the state of New Jersey are reluctant to join this movement in a significant way in light of their undeniable role in contributing to slavery, enslavement, and the subsequent discrimination of Blacks, which I think was laid out very, very well during Professor Greason's presentation. So I think that we are on the side of the angels, as the expression goes, in calling for New Jersey to join this growing movement of recognizing their roles and making amends for their roles during the period of enslavement and subsequent discrimination. So I'll end my remarks there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. I really want to highlight one of the features that you mentioned here, because I think it's important, particularly for those who may be joining us who have a genuinely held belief that a certain entity, a certain public entity, whether it is a local government, a state government, municipal, whatever, or the federal government, ought not be responsible or ought not attempt to engage in reparations because they are innocent or have clean hands. And it's interesting, one, how we think about the concept of clean hands and which entities have clean hands. And as a historian who's done a lot of research on slavery, there is no state government where there was slavery where the state government has clean hands. It simply is not the case that the state of New Jersey somehow has clean hands when it comes to slavery. And even if it did, the government, the federal government, and state governments have provided and funded reparations types of activities, have funded enrichment and sort of economic opportunity initiatives born out of prior harms, even when that entity was not itself the transgressor. So I really appreciate you reminding our public that it need not matter whether New Jersey has clean hands. And if it does not. But it need not matter, because the reality is that much of everything that we're talking about is happening in the state, and state officials and state actors have their hands in this work. And if we aren't even talking about slavery, if we're just talking about the legacy of Jim Crow, the legacy of Black extraction and discrimination against Black people in New Jersey, the state is leading the way. And so I want to thank you for sort of reminding folks of what this looks like in practice, and also reminding us that we need not carry water for the clean hands of oppressors. We need not do so. Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman.
I just say amen to all that you just summarized.
Thank you.
Amen.
Next up, we're going to hear from Professor Jermaine Toney, who's a professor of economics at the Blaustein School. The Blaustein School is well represented here this evening. Thank you so much. Dr. Toney, one of the things that people frequently talk about when discussing the racial wealth gap is that Black Americans are more exposed, more vulnerable to economic security or economic insecurity among their kin. And that because of family obligations and because of persistent wealth gaps among families, among individuals in families, that this is somehow contributing to the racial wealth gap. I'm reminded of the data about sort of how many people have $200 that or $200 and $400 or something can respond to an emergency. So this is sort of at the top of my head right now. I'm wondering, is more exposure to economic insecurity among kin really a significant disadvantage in building Black wealth, or is that overstated at all?
Thank you so much, Dean Tajania. That the answer to the question is yes. But to the public, good evening, everybody. So I've been pursuing work on economic insecurity in the family tree and the Black-white racial wealth gap with Professor Derek Hamilton, who's also a committee member here on the Economic Justice Committee. In my remarks, I'm going to highlight 6 core messages related to this work. Message number 1, there's a stark Black-white gap in net worth in the US. So net worth is the total sum of what you own, your asset values, minus what you owe, so your debt values. The median, as Tajani, as you were saying, the median Black family in America possesses only 15 cents on the dollar of wealth owned by the median white family. The gap is much wider here in the Garden State of New Jersey. The median Black family holds 5 cents on the dollar of wealth held by the median white family. Now, why is wealth important? As Nicole was mentioning, I'll add to what some of the things she was mentioning as well, but it's important for purchasing educational attainments, owning a home, starting a business, supporting young adults having unpaid internships in expensive cities, lowering the likelihood of facing incarceration, and mitigating exposure to economic hardship. Unfortunately, in the annals of our US history, a Black household on the escalator to greater wealth has not been enough to protect them from exposure to racial violence, like lynchings, destruction of Black Wall Streets, white mobs physically removing them from their homes that they bought in predominantly white neighborhoods. Nor was it enough to stop the proliferation of whites-only housing covenants that prohibited the sale of or renting of property to Black people with higher socioeconomic status. The invisible presence of racial covenants meant that generations of Black families would not be able to visibly move into a property that was covenanted, nor would they be able to reap the long-run benefits of present-day house values compared to the white individuals in covenanted residential properties. Message number 2, racial differences in wealth are not just influenced by a person's individual socioeconomic measures. In fact, is more affected by racial differences in socioeconomic status of extended kin networks, especially parents and grandparents. Some examples: leaving property or money when a family member dies. These are bequests. Giving money or property while a family member is alive. These are in vivo transfers. Offering a mix of both bequests and in vivos. This is inheritance. Inheritance is a unique contributor to the Black-white racial wealth gap. Essentially, Black households are starting from too far behind because they inherit much less from their living and departed parents and grandparents. Message number 3, growing research documents that middle-income households are facing high prevalence of economic insecurity, especially Black households. This is the figure you were referring to, Tajania. In contrast to 65% of white middle-income earners, only 44% of Black middle-income earners disclosed that if given 1 month, they would be able to pay a $400 expense with cash or savings. Message number 4. So an explanation for this disparity is that Black middle-income households are far more exposed to having financially insecure kin relatives. In my research with Professor Hamilton, we linked Black and white middle-income earner families to the economic circumstances across 3 generations. What do we find? Compared to their white counterparts, middle-income Black families are likely to experience several key shortcomings, whether they include being more likely to have siblings, parents, grandparents living in poverty, more likely to have siblings, parents, grandparents who rely on social safety net provisions like temporary assistance for needy families or food stamps, and being more likely to have kin networks with wealth levels that are markedly low. The median Black extended family, so this includes the wealth of siblings, parents, grandparents, possesses 23 cents on the dollar of wealth owned by the median white extended family, including their siblings, parents, and grandparents. The takeaway here is that generations in the white family tree are much less prone to face economic hardship and more likely to experience substantially higher levels of wealth. Message number 5. We find that economic hardship in the family tree ranks as one of the top factors that contribute to today's wealth gap between contemporary Black and white Americans. The top 2 factors include parental wealth and a person's average earnings. And that makes sense. It takes resources to build wealth. Okay. Above and beyond average income, with generational wealth transfers, there's a greater capacity for building wealth, making that down payment on the home, purchasing stock shares, having family contributions for starting a business. Without generational transfers, the capacity is more limited. The third factor is economic hardship among family members. In other words, one of the greatest explanations for the continuing wealth gap between Black and white Americans is that Black Americans are much more likely to have close relatives facing significant economic difficulty. The takeaway here, middle-income Black Americans with substantially less resources than their white peers, they do share their wealth among kin that experience economic insecurity. However, that sharing, it comes at a great cost, the depletion of the current generation's economic well-being and a worsening of the Black-white racial wealth gap. My final message, number 6, notably, differences in Black and white family members' economic hardship has an even greater influence on the wealth gap than the impact of disparate outcomes in educational attainment. So the conventional economic wisdom suggests that if we reduce the gaps in educational attainment, we'll automatically reduce the Black-white wealth gap. Such reductions would actually fall short of addressing the main factors contributing to the racial wealth gap. And that's the absence of the intergenerational transfer of wealth over years. And this point is illustrated in census data for New Jersey. Blacks and whites with equivalent levels of education have very different levels of wealth at the median. For those with a high school diploma, Black families have 9 cents per $1 of median white wealth. For college graduates, Black families have 22 cents per $1 of median white wealth. More strikingly, white high school diploma holders have nearly double the wealth at the median level than Black college degree earners. The main reason is that Black college degree earners carry heavier loads of debt, which drags down their net worth. The takeaway here, equalizing educational attainment between Black and white families is not the panacea. It will not eliminate wealth gaps, but Beverly and Derek will each provide more details on the more comprehensive approach that is needed. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Tony. I appreciate the laser focus on wealth transfers and how wealth and kin networks are related, and helping us to understand that despite claims that some of this wealth disparity can be explained by bad personal decision making, I think understanding the web of financial insecurity that ensnares these families may help people better understand sort of where wealth or extra income or sort of holdover capital, where it is going in some of these college educated households. So thank you so much for that perspective. Next up is Beverly Brown Ruggia, who's the Financial Justice Program Director for New Jersey Citizen Action. Beverly, Dr. Tony just promised us that you're going to say more about this very issue. So you are teed up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dean Henderson, and to all my colleagues in the council and everyone here present this evening. This has been a truly expansive and exciting experience to be a part of the council. I learned something every day. I learned some things tonight. And I think everyone in the community has benefited greatly from these ongoing conversations about a campaign for reparations for Black New Jerseyans. In a few minutes, as Jermaine alluded to, Professor Hamilton is going to talk a little bit about various approaches the council is considering to achieve economic justice through reparations. And before he does, I want to take a few minutes to make some cautionary comments and talk a little bit about some of the key considerations for making sure that repairs, especially repairs that could be in the form of individual payments to Black New Jerseyans, are indeed sustainable, that lead to what it is we're trying to achieve with reparations, repairs that bring benefit, that repair harms that Black New Jerseyans have experienced historically since they have been in this state and in this country. So my colleagues on this committee and the council as a whole have made the case that a successful campaign for reparations must be very comprehensive and multifaceted. And we've discussed at length that the successful campaign will have to include ongoing reforms to the current financial and banking system. It will have to include systems innovations. And I would add, it will need and require broad-based organizing and participation in the Black community across the state. In order to, I think when we're thinking of success and sustainability, we want to see repair and reparations that lead to repair that give Black New Jerseyans the tools they need to establish economic stability, secure assets, and to build wealth that can be passed on to future generations. Nicole, Jermaine, others have talked about this specifically. And if we think about the racial wealth gap in New Jersey as a useful measure of what residents have been denied, of what Black citizens in New Jersey have been denied in financial terms, one could argue that the state should write a check for every Black citizen for $300,000. I'm not saying that, but that's a possibility. And that is something that we have to really think carefully about. And I say that because the fact is the same systems and institutions and structural barriers that led to the harms to Africans who came to this country, who ended up in New Jersey, that led to the structural barriers they faced in terms of entering into the economic system and working to take advantage of whatever opportunities it could have for them, and that led to the racial wealth gap, are still in place and still causing harms to Black Americans and Black New Jerseyans. And if we take a minute, others have mentioned redlining. Of course, redlining was one of the most harmful and persistent forms of discrimination, which locked Black and brown, but definitely Black New Jerseyans out of the opportunities to buy homes, to start small businesses, to save for retirement, to have communities that were economically viable. Redlining, of course, we know was designed by, implemented by, and maintained by the federal government. And even after efforts to reverse that policy, unfortunately, we know that the culture and practices of redlining did not go away. They persist to this day. In New Jersey itself, some of the most recent and in fact, biggest settlements for redlining with banks occurred in New Jersey. A $33 million settlement with a bank, Hudson City Savings, in 2015, $13.2 million settlement. Both these are both with the U.S. Justice Department for allegations of deliberately avoiding providing mortgages to eligible Black and Latino customers. Most recently this year, two banks. One was found by the U.S. Justice Department of, again, discriminating against Black, Latino, and Asian, in this case, Asian as well, neighborhoods in 3 counties in New Jersey. And the AG's office in New Jersey also ended up finding. So my point is that there's plenty of evidence, and I do have to make one quick caveat here. These were alleged harms, and none of those institutions have admitted any guilt. But we have to admit that the Department of Justice and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Agent's Office found enough evidence to at least bring these cases, and they did end in settlements. But the evidence there is, I bring it up to say that the systems of banking and finance are still discriminatory. And so if we think about, we generally think about redlining in those terms, discriminating against people who are looking for mortgages, looking for small business loans, looking for investment to come into their communities in any form that would be helpful. We also have to reckon with the fact that we have something called reverse redlining now. Traditionally, civil rights and economic justice advocates were looking for access, making sure that Black and brown people had access to those tools. And now we have the case where, or a situation, a culture in which financial institutions have come up with ways to give people those tools, those so-called tools, but they are harmful. We went through the devastating subprime lending crisis where mortgages were available, but they were toxic mortgages. And in fact, rolled back many of the gains in home ownership for Black New Jerseyans and Americans, across the country. There are many different financial products now that give people access to money immediately that might give them things they need in the short term, but end up destroying them financially in the long term. We saw how in COVID, the government, there's an instance where money was given out to people. And in the case of the payroll protection program, for example, 76% of white-owned businesses received the funding they requested. 54% of Latino-owned businesses received the funding, and only 44% of Black-owned businesses received it. Once again, here's an opportunity. Here's a situation where the government is stepping in to provide something for the general population, and yet we see that Black and brown communities are not receiving the benefit to the extent that they should. There are many other examples, and I wanted to touch on what Jermaine was talking about in terms of education. And as he pointed out, traditionally there's this assumption that if you acquire, college education, you are automatically going to be in a better position on a path to professionalism or careers or jobs that will be higher paying. Something that has happened in this reverse redlining culture is that for-profit colleges, for example, target especially Black women for extraordinarily expensive educational programs that leave them, as Jermaine pointed out, in great debt. Black Americans go into the education system needing more financial aid. And with these for-profit colleges targeting Black women, they're going in needing more money, they're spending more money unnecessarily. So we have a very toxic and predatory environment. And so if I go back to the point about the state of New Jersey could issue checks to individuals, the question is, what is the value of that money if we take it into a hostile economic environment, a hostile environment where systems that were designed originally to exploit, abuse Black Americans? If those systems are still taking advantage of, what is the full value of that check? To paraphrase, Dr. King, we don't really want a bad check. We need a fully, a check that has full value and can be cashed for its full value. So my first point, I guess, I want to make is that we cannot stop ongoing reforms to the systems that have been harmful to Black Americans. We need to strengthen laws that fight discrimination, redlining. We need and enforcement. We need those laws to be enforced. And then I want to move on a little bit. We need to think about innovations, and the committee is going to talk about this more as we go forward in the process. But There are systems that we want to look at that can be more supportive and lead to more sustainable outcomes for Black New Jerseyans, especially if we're going to include any kind of individual payments. We're looking at creating state community reinvestment acts. The National Community Reinvestment Act does not cover, National Community Reinvestment Act does not cover non-banks. We are now, the majority of mortgages are given through non-banks, and yet they are not subject to some of the same oversight and laws that protect borrowers from, or that require, I should say, equitable lending in communities, all communities. And so many of us are looking at putting more oversight at the state level in place for this new environment of lending. And then many of you have heard about the movement across the country for establishing public banking. And so from the reparations movement perspective, the question is there any way that public banking can support and build avenues for more, again, equitable and direct support for a financial culture, or I should say financial environment for Black businesses, Black individuals. Most of the public banks that are being looked at now would not be retail banks, but a public bank supports an ecosystem of smaller community banks, of community development, finance institutions that traditionally are friendlier and more responsive to the needs of Black communities. We need to be building Black institutions. We know that in other communities that other communities build their own systems, microsystems down at the grassroots level to support one another, whether it's lending to each other. But we need, there are no Black-owned banks based in New Jersey. We have a Black-owned bank. It's from DC now, but we do not have a Black-owned bank in New Jersey. We need to be building those kinds of institutions that know and understand and are in Black communities, so that if reparations come, we're investing in ourselves and building economic vehicles for success ourselves. We know that there are some innovations such as guaranteed income. We need to be supporting leaders who are able to come up with these kinds of innovations. And then lastly, I want to talk about broad-based organizing and participation across the Black community. There's no campaign that will be successful unless the people who have the needs and are experiencing the issues that we're trying to address are if they're not a part of the work, it's not likely that the campaign will succeed. And so as we go forward, a sustainable, successful reparations must include broad-based outreach, developing leadership within the community to help drive the work of the reparations campaign. And then we need to build extensive stakeholder, formats for extensive stakeholder and grassroots interaction, input, and then advocacy. So I'm just going to leave it there. I hope I haven't gone over time, but my three main points are that the systems that exist, we must continue to fight to reform them. Secondly, we must innovate to create new systems that are part of and of the Black community and are innovative. And then lastly, we have to do a lot of groundwork within the community to make this campaign of the people, of the Black New Jerseyans who we want to see benefit from reparations.
Thank you so much for that, Beverly. When you were talking about we have to build institutions, I was thinking, I was on mute. I was thinking, and in some cases, rebuild institutions, because New Jersey has had Black banks.
Yes.
New Jersey's last Black bank just closed in 2019. So when we
That's
are
correct.
thinking about institution building, Black Americans have been building institutions since the 1800s. Black institution building is familiar to Black Americans. So,
Yes.
I'm sort of thinking about the Prince Hall Masons and just the institution building that kind of comes out of the Revolutionary War era and into the early 19th century. in New Jersey, this was no different. Black banking was being used to really address some of that persistent risk that you were talking about, and the necessity for us to sort of think differently about systems and to think differently about all of the players, right? Not only the banking, but also some of the buy now, pay later, which is leading to people being in all sorts of debt over the past 5 years, and how that debt is making it impossible for people to build real wealth. All of these things are related. And if we have to think about systemic risk among Black Americans and Black people in New Jersey in the same ways that we think about systemic risk as a nation, those systemic risks are always at play. And if we aren't thinking about system innovation in the way that you describe, then any types of reforms or changes will only ever be a band-aid approach, because the systems are powerful, and the risk is quite high. So thank you so much for sort of bringing those threads together for us, and pushing our conversation in that space. This is much
Thank you so much.
appreciated. I am excited to introduce our next speaker. This is Professor Derek Hamilton, who's the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. Dr. Hamilton, so as we are thinking about systems innovation and addressing reparations from different angles, I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what are some of the pros and cons and even feasibilities of various approaches to implementing reparations, even if we have to go back a bit to hear sort of, where this comes from, and how we can think about this in our current moment.
Yeah. So let me start with gratitude. Thank you, Dean Henderson. Thank you to my fellow committee members. And it's an honor to be a part of this, but it also is grave. There's a lot of gravity in what we're doing. The legacies of ancestors, the contemporary inequities that we face, and then a future, trying to promote a brighter future that will redress the injustices and pave a way. And here's another key point. This is about human rights that ultimately will create a better pathway for all of humanity. So that's a grave task and responsibility that we all have. Just want to make the point that going back to culpability, these were state-sanctioned and state-perpetrated injustices for which we seek to redress. That's a key point. So when people talk about individual culpability and responsibility, frankly, that becomes irrelevant, because there's a representative body, the state, that represents all of us, that's ultimately culpable. We talked a lot about the material harms that were created, but there also were psychological and physical harms created. The intergenerational transmission of carceral state, of the state use of physical violence to constrain Black individuals, and even the threat and stress and stigma associated with race itself. For Black people to cognitively always have to think about a transaction and whether their race is culprit or not, well, that's a huge cost. That's a huge burden that we also need to consider when thinking about what the harms are. There's benefits associated with a raceless identity, and that's not a benefit afforded to Black people. And by no means am I saying that we should be raceless. We should be proud, and everybody should be able to have the ability to have cultural rights and be proud of where they come from and who they come from. But what is problematic is if that identity has transactional value. It should have no transactional value whatsoever. So that's some of the framing. I could also say an emphasis on property rights, which is the way in which our economy has evolved. the way in which our laws have evolved without any acknowledgement of the immorality by which that property has come to be distributed in the first place is immoral. It's prima facie immoral and will only double down on existing injustices and inequities from the past. So your question, what are some of the ways in which we can think about redressing the harms? The one that is most talked about and perhaps the most obvious is cash. It's straight up a check or some transfer. And then I negated to say, in the interest of legacy, that the things I'm about to talk about today and the things that we all are talking about today, and it was pointed out a great deal by Professor Coleman, aren't so new and novel. Like, I want to point out Robert S. Brown, the founder of the Black Economic Research Center and the Review of Black Political Economics, and a founding member of the Caucus of Black Economists, which has evolved today to the National Economic Association, which is primarily made up of Black economists and interested in redressing issues related to the Black community. Well, he published an article in the American Economic Review in 1972, which is laying out a lot of what I'm going to present today. And it's important to recognize that legacy. So the problem with cash, well, here's the benefit of cash. It's simple, it's non-paternalistic, it's non-patronizing. It says this harm was committed to you, and without condition, we're offering a transfer. That's elegant. What is problematic, and people have made the joke, and I use this to make the example. People say, well, if you gave Black people cash, they'll just turn around and go buy Cadillacs. Well, one of the things that reparations is redressing is that inaccurate narrative that inequality is grounded in some deficit behavior or attitude amongst Black people, but rather grounded in resource deprivation and psychological impunity in which certain sanctions are imposed on Black people. But going back to that point, the problem is that Black people aren't going to necessarily buy Cadillacs. If they do, so what? That's what they value. That's what they like. Everybody can make consumer choices. The problem is they don't own stocks in Cadillac. That Black people don't own the means of production because of the racial wealth gap that has been cited earlier. Because we don't own the means of productions, we're not large landowners. Because of that reason, if you were to offer a cash transfer, you have the potential unintended consequence of what some economists label immiserating growth. If you imagine a multiplier effect, if you do not own the means of productions, the stimulus that would be generated from the transfer of that cash could ultimately lead to greater inequality from which we started. So I'm thinking about pros and cons. That's one of the cons. And as we mentioned, the pros. So there's something elegant about at least some form of it coming in the form of cash. But I wouldn't advocate for it all to come in the form of cash for the reasons I mentioned. Not that Black people are going to make bad decisions. It's an existing structure building on what Beverly described. It's an existing structure that Black people have been excluded from. So therefore, there should be some transfer of either capital, means of production, and or land in the forms of reparations implementation. And what that would do is not only offer the value of that transfer, but pay dividends in perpetuity, provide the benefits that Jermaine described a great deal when talking about wealth. It is wealth that begets more wealth. So wealth itself can offer an asset that can pay in perpetuity. Of course, we will need the state to protect that capital in ways that they have for white people and not Black people, so that Black people will continue to benefit from that in perpetuity. Other forms of transfers that people have talked about are Marshall Plans. So you could build up Black institutions. You could imagine a host of resources. You can set up a fund for which entities could apply for and receive a grant to build Black institutions, which has the effect of potentially generating a communal asset, which also can pay dividends to a community. The risk with that is gentrification itself. How will you protect that asset so that the intended recipients will be able to benefit from it and not be vulnerable to those with capital being able to take advantage of the surge of capital that might not have been intended for them in the first place? So it can create a moral hazard. But on the other hand, it can, as you discussed, Dean Henderson, rebuild some of our previous institutions that we had, and even generate some new institutions. So those are some things to think about. I also want to point out a study that I was part of with a bunch of colleagues. It was led by Dania Francis, who's a Black woman professor at UMass Boston, that looked at the ways in which the state has been involved in essentially the theft of Black land. So if we think about farmers, and New Jersey was certainly not immune to it, we calculate in a conservative way, at a conservative estimate, that the grand total of that theft is at least $326 billion nationwide. So there would be a tremendous amount that occurred in New Jersey as well. So there's some direct link to land loss when we think about land redress. So I'm running out of time. I know I'm being long-winded. I apologize. Let me conclude with a couple of things to think about. So reparations involves redress. It also involves acknowledgement. One without the other is incomplete. Acknowledgement without redress is simply a promise that's somewhat empty. And then also it does not redress the things that we described. But redress alone without the acknowledgement leaves us vulnerable to future public policy that does not ground poverty and inequality in what it actually is grounded in, which is resource deprivation. We have a society that builds its public policy on trying to coerce, trying to change, and mostly sanction the behavior of poor people, Black people, and other people that aren't doing well. That policy is wrongheaded. What we need is investments in people's capabilities. What we need is public policy directed at our most treasured resources, which is people and the environments in which we live in. So the benefit of something like reparations, which is grounded in a human rights concept, is that it can lead to paradigm change where we have a government having the fiduciary responsibility to ensure not only civil, political, social, and cultural rights, but economic rights, a base level of resource so that people can thrive, so that they can have the stuff they need to be innovative, to reap the rewards of their efforts, and we can all have a better society. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those powerful words, Dr. Hamilton, and for bringing together these threads about economic and resource deprivation, as well as intergenerational trauma and violence, and privilege and stigma, and how these and of course theft, and how these lead to the circumstances that we find ourselves in now. Sort of, this is almost like the pre-story, right? The backstory for what Dr. Tony was talking about with respect to Black families and wealth accumulation and wealth disparities in New Jersey and elsewhere. Sort of this is why this sort of contributes to that, and we absolutely appreciate this perspective.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of our committee members for really getting us started with deep, sustained research and perspective on what economic justice might mean and what economic justice might look like in the context of a call for reparations. I want to encourage folks to please engage with the committee. I know you're going to hear from Jean-Pierre in a second, but we are still open to hearing from our various stakeholders. And it's critically important that folks are here and that you remain involved in this process. And of course, shout out to everyone who is watching on YouTube. We always appreciate the engagement there with folks who are in a lot of ways sort of, keeping the conversation going in another space. And so we are grateful for that as well. I'm going to turn it over to Jean-Pierre, and that will get us started on the public comment portion of our meeting. Thank you so much, committee.
Thank you so much, Dean Henderson, and really thank you so much to the Economic Justice Committee for your brilliance, for your insights, for your time. We really appreciate your contributions, and thank you so much once again. And thank you, Dean Henderson, as always, for a masterclass in moderating. We really appreciate it. That was, I can't say this enough, absolutely fantastic. And I hope you all in the audience appreciate this, as well as future viewers who'll be watching this recording on demand. And we really appreciate you all expanding your understandings of this topic in relationship to reparations and shedding light and thinking about New Jersey in a different kind of way in relation to economic justice and the need for it, and making the important case for economic justice through reparations in New Jersey. But one of the things, and I think this is incredibly important, is, as Beverly pointed out, the work of this council does not end with the report. We will continue to advocate, continue to mobilize around this report come June. This is one phase of a many-phased effort. And I would be remiss if I did not make some comments about this particular moment that we are in. And as many of you are aware, we have entered a new moment, and some will call it a crisis, with the troubling echoes of the past, marking a difficult and treacherous time ahead for multiracial democracy, racial justice, and reparations. This is an inflection point characterized by the evisceration of affirmative action in higher education, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, unvarnished hostility towards DEI, critical race theory, and a glaring silence around the significance of racial justice towards multiracial democracy. This critical moment has scrambled and rearranged what were previously considered durable axioms. Since Reconstruction, the federal government has generally served as the protector of civil rights for Black people, counterposed to the notorious invocation of quote unquote states' rights, a barely veiled enunciation of white supremacy, Jim Crow, and Herrenfolk democracy. Yet, in a rather ironic role reversal, this moment was ushered in by a Supreme Court skeptical of institutional institutional anti-Black racism, coupled with an incoming presidential administration with its sights set on imploding multiracial democracy via attacks on the laws, ideas, institutions, and people working to build it. The courage to stand up, speak out, and advocate in support of the matters of Black lives, racial and social justice, multiracial democracy, and reparations is now in the hands of the states and advocates working at the state and local level. Thus, it is imperative at this moment that the work of reparations be moved forward by the Institute at the state level, and our work will provide an example for other advocates in the state and for the nation as a whole. And now we move on to the public comment portion. I know the committee looks forward to your comments, having your thoughts inform their work going forward. And thank you to those of you who have previously submitted public comment. We really appreciate it. And feel free to contact us through the website, njreparationscouncil.org. That's njreparationscouncil.org. This is now your time to express your views. There are a few rules for public comment. As pointed out in the flyer and publicity materials, only those, well, we will expand it now to those who not only previously registered, but those who are in the Zoom. You will be limited to 3 minutes. There will be a timer on the upper right. I will give you a 15-second warning. And there will be a 10-second grace period on the other side of the 3 minutes. We will mute you if you continue past that grace period, no exceptions. If you're unable to get to you this evening for whatever reason, and you sign up to provide public comment, we'd still like to hear from you. And as I said, once again, you can go to the website. Finally, one last important disclaimer. We will not tolerate any hate speech, personal attacks, or threats of any kind, and you will promptly be removed from this meeting. I will now pass over the hosting duties to our committee co-directors, Henry and Walter, to moderate the public comment portion.
Walter, if you could introduce Mia White. You're muted.
Thank you. We were unable to unmute for a couple seconds. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mia White from the New School, who will open up public comment. So thank you so much, Mia.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our esteemed council co-chairs and the Economic Justice Committee members. I just want to be very brief in affirmation of the powerful presentation you just provided to us. And I wanted to share that for us in the Environmental Justice Committee, of which I'm a member, a just future for Black people in New Jersey has to be understood spatially, because we believe that liberation struggle is place-based struggle, with redlining and zoning being two key examples that we heard about today of still unfolding spatial struggle. We see how the control of land and nature has always been central to the development of rights and protections in the United States, rights and protections that through racial and environmental racism have been systematically denied to Black people in New Jersey. In fact, because we know that environmental racism is a leading cause of death in communities of color, we think about these spatial legacies of racial oppression as both economic and environmental, a pernicious kind of slow violence. Climate justice, for example, is described as the afterlife of slavery, while also understood as an aftershock of slavery and racial capitalism. The shocks keep coming. For instance, who will be in an economic position to fight displacement, to retrofit their homes, to rebuild after floods, to expect access to clean water and affordable energy, and to remedy the kaleidoscope of health impacts because these public goods have been denied to Black people? We believe that climate action in the built environment looks like the opposite of displacement. In other words, deep access to safe and affordable housing and to clean air and water. And Black community land trusts and energy co-ops, by the way, suggest one approach. But we are deeply worried, for example, when we see the insurance industry beginning to deny coverage to families living in ecologically vulnerable places or in floodplains in New Jersey. And this is just one example of how toxic institutional practices produce places and neighborhoods. We know folks live in these areas as a function of a long time entrenched environmental racism, but the now unfolding climate crisis also disproportionately impacts Black communities. In close, we ask that our economic justice analysis maintain the simultaneity of the economic and environmental relationship, and that the interrelated need for a reparative justice framework be grounded in community resilience and livability for Black people in New Jersey. With appreciation to the committee, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those very, very profound observations, and we will look forward to opportunity to incorporate those thoughts into some of our further deliberations. We're going to turn now to Claude Taylor as our next speaker, commenter. Is Mr. Taylor available?
I'm here, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the entire committee and this broader effort in New Jersey to raise these really important social justice issues. I have I'm curious about the inclination for some folks who, as a part of the Great Migration, made their way up to northern states and northern cities, the inclination to return to the South as a way of reclaiming some solidarity and belonging and perhaps stronger economic opportunities. Would anyone on the panel want to just reference for us the pros and cons of that kind of gesture? And I suspect that some of the reluctance is the labor and work invested in northern cities and northern states. That's the question. What about the move south? Is that feasible, viable, or what are some of the limitations related to that? Thank you for tonight.
So I would open up for any committee members that want to speak to it. I can provide a transition to our next speaker once someone offered a comment, if there's a comment that you'd like to share.
I'll make a quick one, which is I think part of the goals of, for me, reparations is giving people mobility. If they want to, take their family somewhere else, they should be able to do that. But we just also need to make sure that anyone who's in New Jersey and staying in New Jersey has the benefit of reparations to allow them to do that. But I don't see any issue with people wanting to move elsewhere. That is part of what makes that's part of wealth. That's part of, and I put that in quotes, but that's the ability. Mobility is part of that. And I think what the previous speaker just said, is to live in a safe, clean place anywhere. And if somebody wants to start a business, start a farm, either somewhere where their family lived previously, or they just want to do that now. But I think the point is that Black New Jerseyans should have choices and have the ability to pursue whatever opportunity they want to make them and their families whole. That's all I'll say.
Thank you so much, Beverly. I would say a small additional comment. What I've seen just out of New Jersey, there's reverse migration, and families are moving towards Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, but also especially to the Carolinas. Really enormous move to kind of coastal Carolina and Georgia. And what we're seeing within this are trends of displacing historic Black communities that are under threat in places like Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And so there are layers of kind of contradictions in the process. And I agree with Bev's point entirely about mobility and migration. But I move towards a goal that I've seen for a lot of generations of Americans is to have homes in different parts of the country. Some people might have a family home in Florida or Alabama and still live in California or Arizona. And so this is part of what the promise of property accumulation in this country is. And it's been the denial of that kind of freedom and flexibility and wealth building that's at the heart of the work that we're doing tonight. And so I think we can build a larger universe of possibility out of what we're discussing as policy going forward in the next decade. I see we have Stephen Young who is signed up to comment, so I hope they are still in attendance.
No, looks like he may have stepped off.
All right. So then we open it up. Well, Henry? So yes, we had opened the floor to other folks in attendance who would like to share a comment, suggestion, or question.
If the floor is open, maybe I can say something about the previous question as well, add a little bit, in that part of the reason the South is underdeveloped compared to some areas in the North, if we measure, I guess, some of the economic capacities, is the harms that were done to Black people themselves, and we can tie it into Black institutions. So I guess a great deal of what my fellow committee members have talked about Professor Greason as well as Professor White, Black institutions like HBCUs were not permitted to grow and develop to the same tune as some of the historically white institutions as a result of these harms. So if you had a Black GI returning from World War II and they were not able to access the GI Bill in a localized way to the same extent as a white GI, or because of housing discrimination, the Black HBCUs couldn't absorb additional students. That is a historical act that limited their capacity to benefit from the greatest surge of resources into higher education from that period of GIs returning from World War II than we've seen across the globe. And that might be why you end up with some of the huge disparities in endowments. But I do want to point out that migration to the South, like Beverly said, we want people to have agency, authentic agency, not being displaced, that it's an authentic choice. And that in and of itself wouldn't be reparations, but indicative of the society we're trying to promote.
So we also have time for folks if they want to raise their hands. Audience members, if you can raise your hands if you'd like to jump in.
While we're waiting for the next person to sign up, I think I just want to join the list of people who admired the contributions by Dean Henderson tonight. I think she did a really, really terrific job of understanding and making sense of all of our presentations, and then teasing out some really interesting questions and insightful points for follow-up. So that was a terrific job that you did, I think.
And I wanted to send my appreciations to Professor White around environmental racism. That is something that is not often lifted up in these conversations, and there's literal cost of lives due to environmental racism. Environmental justice communities experience higher pollution and the health effects of that than any other communities in the state. And if we're gonna be real in this moment, looking at the progressive community is divided. We have a lot of Black and brown environmental justice coalitions, as well as um, white-led justice coalitions, not all, but where they're not seeing eye to eye. So part of the work is the work that we have to do internally within our own communities around social justice movements, and how can we integrate the realities of what's happening on the ground, the disproportionate harm that are happening to our Black and brown neighbors, that we need to pay attention and lift that up. Because if we're not protecting people who are most harmed by public policy, then we're not going to help our communities at all.
Absolutely correct. And as I think the only person living in Minnesota on the call, the oddball, they're doing New Jersey work. And I would say today is not the day to move to Minnesota. It is 1 degree Fahrenheit outside right now. But in terms of climate change and climate migration, we're seeing very real effects coming to, I would say, Duluth, which is northern Minnesota. But people fleeing wildfires, fleeing flooding, hurricane season, these real existential threats that we're seeing across the country, if we're not paying attention to them and looking at them, there are ways to deal more constructively in New Jersey with it. But I think we need to I think that's a great area that Professor White brought to us to look both nationally and specifically within our state.
So we go back to see if Mr. Stephen Young was able to get back on the call and is prepared to chime in with a comment or a question.
He is not.
Okay, we look forward to hearing from anyone else at this point as well. This is a
Oh,
rarity. We
excuse me?
generally generate quite a bit of back and forth as a result of our comments and exchanges during our committee meetings.
I have a pensive and thoughtful audience. They're not ready to respond.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a question, if that's all right. Oh. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
perfect. Sorry, first time doing asking
Hi.
this in a public forum. My name's Brad Horowitz, and I wanted to ask the council, particularly on grassroots activism, to look into equities, into equity. I'm trying to set up a program actually with Professor Walter Greason, um, concerning a red bank, potential redlining and red bank. And I'm very new at this, and I'm not sure how to really get started on it per se. And I want to know if the council had any resources or ideas that could really help out.
May I ask a couple questions of you?
Sure, go ahead.
So when you say redlining, have you identified a specific institution that may be practicing redlining? Is that what's happened? Or are you talking more generally speaking?
I think generally I have very limited information on the Red Bank Shrewsbury area. I'm from Marlboro, New Jersey.
Sure.
But something that I noticed with Red Bank when I was doing a legal paper on the Thomas Fortune Center Museum, I heard from Miss Gilda Rogers, and she spoke about, excuse me, and Miss Rogers spoke about how on the west side of Red Bank, it was an area where predominantly non-whites would go and live, and that kind of surprised me because I couldn't recall like Red Bank or Central Jersey being a city or area targeted by the Federal Housing Agency from the 30s and 40s that began the process of redlining. I always kept that in the back of my mind. I ended up getting a part-time, a full-time job for a while in one of the law firms, and I just kept noticing the West Side was very different from the main town of Red Bank. Um, and Walter's been kind enough to allow me to look at some of the papers and the work that he's done. And I was just learning more and more about Red Bank from old protests and potential police brutality all on the West Side. You had the 1960s and 70s unrest that occurred during that time. I'm familiar vaguely with the Asbury unrest from the 60s and early 70s.
Sure.
But it's very, very general. And that's why I figured in order to get a grassroots project going, hopefully get the community involved, I'll need more information. And I'm just very new at this. They didn't teach me that in law school.
Well, I'm sure there's others who want to comment, but I think some of the ways that you might get a sense of what's going on. First of all, even though doesn't matter whether these homeowners were there in the 40s, it doesn't matter that the redlining persists. Sort of baked into different communities. As I pointed out, a number of banks are still practicing redlining, or at least we see that they are. So a couple things I would say is you might want to look at, I'm assuming that most of these, it's mostly you're talking about homeowners or there are renters as well. In the case of renters, one of the things you might do is do an education program on what housing rights are, so that if people are going into that community and think that they might be the victims of discrimination, they can report that to you can report it directly to the Department of Civil Rights in the Attorney General's office. You can report it to my organization, which is New Jersey Citizen Action. There's one other organization in the state that does what we call fair housing testing. So if we believe that there's a place, a landlord who's discriminating, we can actually go and test. We can investigate. We turn over anything we find to the AG's office and the Office of the U.S. Attorney. So there are, and I will tell you that right now, the New Jersey AG's office is very, very concerned about redlining and very actively looking to investigate instances of redlining. But first, I think you might get a sense of what's going on if you conduct perhaps an education project where you go into the community, maybe churches, community centers, and you talk about what their housing rights are, their fair housing rights are. And you may get feedback from people who describe experiences and activities that could actually be redlining. in terms of home ownership, you know, I mean, it's the same thing for purchasing home. If somebody feels like they've been discriminated against in the process of purchasing a home, you can also report them to my organization, directly to the AG's office. There are a number of places you can do that. And Walter, if you can follow up with me later. I'll put my email in the, oh no, I can't, but we can get you my email address. But there are ways, I would say, if from a grassroots level, you want to start talking to people in the community to find out if they may not know it, but they maybe have experiencing things that are an indication of redlining. The other thing I would do is look at what banks are there in that area, who's lending in that area. There are public records of their lending history. And I won't go into it now, but I can show you how to look that up. It's called home mortgage data. And you can look that up and you can start to find patterns, and you can see whether or not an institution, they may not be horrible, but you might see indications they're not generally lending equitably. So if you reach out to me, I can give you a number of things. I don't know if Nicole or anybody else who does any organizing might have suggestions, but I would start with an education campaign about housing rights.
Thank you.
My expertise is more at the public policy level. How do you not only educate, but create lasting change? And it requires being persistent with your lawmakers and educating them about what issues are going on in their communities, because they really do respond to the people who complain. So the loudest who is they will do something for the people who are the loudest, and often the people who are quietest are people who've suffered for so long. So we do need more voices in the public policy space. So really engage with your local city council members, but especially your state representatives as well. And there's a lot of really great groups who are doing housing advocacy in all sorts of ways, from homelessness, so affordable housing, fair share housing. They're an organization that literally sues every municipality in the state multiple times to enforce their affordable housing laws. That's all they do, is make cities and towns enforce their laws, because it's such a pervasive problem in the state. And that's just one piece of it, affordable housing. And then what Bev is talking about is more of like the appraisal discrimination, which piece of legislation that we fought very hard to pass, so that we can start. It's not going to end discrimination in appraisal, but it's acknowledging it and putting some standards around it.
And this week, another bill was introduced to strengthen that. So that might be an issue that you want to follow, Brad, is the whole appraisal discrimination, how the state is approaching that and advocates are approaching that. Because that is also something where we need the public to be more aware of appraisal discrimination, because people don't know that that it's happening to them necessarily. So education about that. And then, as I think, as Nicole said, making sure that you're keeping the legislators aware. But you can always follow that there's a lot of legislation going on that addresses some of the things you're talking about.
I'll say one more last thing. Next year is an election year, not only for the governor, but also for every single person in the legislature. And usually, and I want to, broadly speaking, because I'll be generous, broadly speaking, it's during those election years where they don't want to do anything seemingly uncontroversial. So part of our jobs in the space, particularly as researchers and advocates, is really, how do I put this nicely? It's really spending as much time as possible working with lawmakers to make the right choice, to protect their communities, no matter, how much money they have, where they live, who they are, regardless of zip code, of their race and ethnicity, because the more pressure that they get from their voting community, the more they'll be incentivized to create public policy that protects everybody. But we need more and more voices.
I'll be less careful and just say, now's the time to press. You want to get in front of them. You want to make them talk about these issues. You can send them a list of things that you want them to address as they campaign. So I would just say this is definitely a time to push, and the gubernatorial candidate as well. They need to hear what's going on, and you have an opportunity to push them to come forward and take a stand on the things that you care about. And I think, Nicole, it's just the assembly this year, right? I think assembly.
It's everybody.
wrong.
It's everybody. It's terrifying. No, it's not terrifying, but it's all at once, which is a lot for the advocates.
Big deal for us to get out there and really press for who we want in office. Brad, definitely, we talk all the time, but like follow up with me at Calvary Baptist Church on Bridge Street. There's a group of young people who definitely need to talk with you, and that would give us a base probably in either January or February that we could start to organize with. So we can get that ball moving.
What days do you expect? Well, what
But
days?
we want to get there on a Sunday. Sunday is when we're going to meet with the big number, and then we can draw out a weekly meeting out of that.
Is it this coming Sunday or?
Oh, no. Early January, man. I'm in
Okay,
Minnesota. I'll be back there like on the 3rd, 4th, that round from 3rd, 4th, 5th. I'll be up there.
All right, good. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, Mr. Horowitz, we really thank you for not only your question, but for the local effort that you have underway. And we do hope that some of the responses here have provided some thoughts and ideas for you and the next step for your initiative. Are there any other questions from our listening friends?
Hello, my name is Dana Patton, and I'm part of a group called Jersey City Together, their education team, and we push for fully funded and equitable public schools. And I'm just wondering how any of you feel that the great disparity and segregation and inequity and everything from the way we funded buildings with the SDA to the way that we fund our schools through property taxes fits in with the push for reparations.
I love this question. We actually did a report a couple of years ago on this very issue. How our local property tax system has set up a system of inequality. And a lot of that was created through redlining, exclusionary zoning, and other types of discrimination. And what we see today are segregated communities. And typically Black and brown communities have less wealth than white communities, and that has been done by design. You probably know about the education, this segregation lawsuit that is happening, and we hope to, eagerly waiting of what's going to come out of that and what policy solutions may come out of that too. But also what kind of tying in this moment with, the state leadership changes, but also with the federal incoming administration. We need to be really paying attention to that as well, because what we are hearing from Congress for their 2025 legislative agenda is reducing the amount of spending for non-defense spending. So about 1/3 of that money goes to state and local municipalities. So that means education, public safety, infrastructure. And so if we get reduced funding from the federal level, and if in the state right now, I could go on about this, budget's my thing. And if we are potentially facing a fiscal crisis in our state budget, and we'll find that out more specifically next year, in about next month of how bad that is. But currently, the administration in New Jersey is asking for all the state agencies to look for ways to reduce their own agency budgets, including education. So that's going to have with the federal and the state, that's going to be a huge ripple effect. and potentially increase inequity for our kids across the state. So this is something we really need to pay attention to and put our lawmakers' feet to the fire so that we are protecting everybody in the state, particularly trans kids too, because those programs will, those types of programs often get put on the chopping block first. And particularly Black trans kids, they're the ones who are really the most left behind out of any person in the society.
Isn't that threat compounded also, Nicole, by attempts to divert some of the money to private parochial schools
Oh,
and
that's a whole
charter
other issue.
schools?
And we're actually coming out with a report on that too in February.
You're a
Yes.
straight man tonight, is that it?
Yes. Yes, there is a disproportionate amount of charter school funding that has less oversight than public schools, where, yeah, we're creating usually kids of color have poorer outcomes in these schools, not all of them, but a lot of them on average. And, teacher pay is also a huge difference between public and private charter schools where they're resourced a lot less. And what the problem is with the charter school education receiving public funds is that they can pick the students they want. And that often leads to kids without disabilities, kids without needing resources for English language learning, and often kids leaving behind kids who are non-white. So that is absolutely correct.
Oh, Miss Dina Patton, with that group you mentioned, what was the name of it?
Jersey City Together, it's part of New Jersey Together, which is an offshoot of the Metro IAF, the Industrial Areas Foundation organizing. We follow a practice of organizing that's listen, organize, act. So we listen to the people most affected by an issue, and then we organize and decide how we can push forward, and then we have actions.
Because you're interesting, because your mention on school funding and something that kind of when I was looking over the information regarding redlining was that Red Bank had accusations and had a federal investigation to school segregation. And redlining essentially not only essentially segregates not only the schools based on the demographics, from what I understand, but also because it limits, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but it also skews the housing value. And so that limits how we fund our schools. So ultimately, it's a two-way effort to essentially make the school poor as much as possible while also making segregated. I think that's what spurred the Boston busing crisis, when activists realized that the schools were not even were technically desegregating, but not actually doing it. And they looked at the property taxes and how the schools were getting funded.
Well, I believe that New Jersey, and this is the group to correct me if I'm wrong, but is the sixth most segregated in the nation for Black children. So we haven't come very far from that, unfortunately.
Seems like. Do you mind if I'll eventually have to I do want to reach out to the organization and if we're able to connect and touch base on schools segregation efforts. I want to know if that maybe can help look into the effects of redlining, especially if Red Bank doesn't necessarily have a written mortgage or a set of policies that said a certain area would be segregated, but more of like an implicit understanding. And I'm wondering if
Oh,
that
Brad,
played into.
we can continue this. There's
Oh,
ways we
sorry.
can get you linked in and keep it going. We are coming down into the last stretch of what we're doing tonight. So I think we can get anyone who hasn't commented yet. We'd love to hear from you. Or if there are kind of concluding comments from any of our panelists as we shift into the next phase of what we've got to do going into 2025. 3, 2, 1. All right. So, Jean-Pierre, please come on back up, wrap us up for the night. Thank you, everyone, for the contributions that you shared with us.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you who provided public comment. Really appreciate it. And thank you to so much for our panelists for being so flexible and being so insightful and gracious with your thoughts and insights, and generous as well with your insights and brilliance. So thank you so much. I do want to give a shout out to Mia White. Professor Mia White is on our Environmental Justice Committee. So if you want to watch their public session, please go to the website njreparationscouncil.org, where they discuss the link between reparations and environmental justice. So, and keep an eye out for the report in June 2025, where the Environmental Justice Committee will talk about the impact of racism and slavery and Jim Crow interrogation on New Jersey's communities, particularly within the context of the environment. And they have some wonderful recommendations. So I look forward to you all reading that. I'm very excited. And then also, I just want to make sure, once again, that you have it on your calendars that on February 12th, once again, February 12th, that's a Wednesday, that will be the last public session of the New Jersey Reparations Council. And that will be hosted by our Public Education and Narrative Committee. So February 12th. And I just want to say, thank you to all of you, for your interest and your excitement, because we will need that as the work moves along, as we shift this work from research to advocacy and organizing. So keep an eye out for that. We will be leaning on you for your energy and for your interest. And I hope you all have a rest of a good night, a good evening, a good holiday season. And I will see you all hopefully in February. And thank you once again, everyone, for your time this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, and everyone.